Welcome to the SANS Science Experience, your source for the most current and impactful research and preprints in science. Before we dive into today's captivating topic, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It truly helps support the SANS Science Experience and allows us to keep bringing you these in-depth explorations into cutting-edge research. Okay, let's unpack one of biology's longest-standing mysteries. Why does eating less often lead to a longer life? For generations, biologists have seen this remarkable thing happen, dietary restriction, or DR, extending lifespan, sometimes dramatically. And it's across nearly every species studied, from yeast to monkeys, even more complex organisms. But it wasn't just a curiosity, it was a real evolutionary puzzle.
Indeed. Dietary restriction is, it's exceptionally well known to extend lifespan across a broad range of life forms. Yet the evolutionary forces driving this, they've been remarkably elusive. For decades, scientists have grappled with why this happens, especially since limiting nutrient intake also typically reduces fertility. So that presents a central challenge. If you have fewer offspring, what's the evolutionary advantage? How does this enhance longevity stick around? What's the driver?
Right. And today we're going to dive into some groundbreaking new research that fundamentally challenges some long-held assumptions. It offers a completely fresh perspective on how lifespan extension under DR truly evolves, moving way beyond simple trade-offs. It's a journey that really redefines how we think about aging and adaptation. To truly appreciate how revolutionary this new research is, you first need to understand the landscape of ideas that came before it. The prevailing theories that tried to solve this longevity puzzle. Historically, there were a few main adaptive hypotheses trying to explain why DR extends lifespan. One really popular idea was the resource reallocation theory.
Exactly. This theory posits that when nutrients are scarce, organisms make an adaptive choice. And by choice, we mean an evolved biological strategy, not like a conscious decision. The idea is they delay reproduction. Instead, they put their remaining limited resources into somatic maintenance.
Somatic maintenance, basically body upkeep.
Right, body upkeep and repair until food becomes available again. The core idea is survival becomes the immediate priority, and that comes at the direct cost of producing immediate offspring. This often gets discussed through the lens of the disposable soma hypothesis.
Disposable soma, the idea that our bodies are kind of expendable after reproduction.
Pretty much. So if resources are low, the organism prioritizes living to reproduce another day, maintaining the soma.
Okay, like a biological triage. Prioritize survival until things get better. That makes intuitive sense. But were there other ideas floating around besides just reallocating resources?
Yes, there were also recycling theories. These viewed increased longevity as more of an unselected byproduct, like a fortunate accident rather than a direct evolutionary goal.
An accident? How so?
Well, nutrient recycling suggested that recycling proteins in cells happens mainly to maximize immediate reproduction. Longevity was just a side effect of being efficient.
Yeah, okay.
And clean cupboards, on the other hand, propose that individuals use up damaged cells and misfolded proteins for immediate survival when things are tough. Again, improved late-life survival was just a fortunate consequence of this kind of cellular house cleaning.
Like tidying up helps you function better later, even if that wasn't the main point.
Exactly.
So, stepping back then, what's the common thread? These older theories generally implied some kind of necessary compromise, right? A trade-off between reproduction and survival.
Yeah, or that lifespan extension was just sort of an accidental benefit, not something directly selected for. It painted a picture of a tough biological balancing act.
But the new study we're focusing on today, led by Sarah D. Irish and her colleagues, they set out to rigorously test these very hypotheses, and they used a clever experimental setup with Caenorhabditis elegans nematodes.
Ah, yes. C. elegans. Tiny worms, you can barely see them.
Right, but they're incredibly powerful in aging research. Their genetics, their lifespan, it's all well understood and easy to work with.
And what's truly fascinating here is how ingeniously they tricked the nematodes to test these trade-offs. They designed 4 key treatment groups. First, regular ad libitum food, basically, all the food the worms wanted.
Okay, the control group.
Then, regular food plus food odor, call it F+O. Then the critical dietary restriction group, DR 24 hours with no food.
And the fourth.
And crucially, dietary restriction plus food odor, DR+O. That food odor part was central. Previous work suggested scent could partially restore reproduction even under DR.
Ah, so they could directly test if boosting reproduction under DR costs the worms in terms of lifespan.
Precisely. They let them really poke at that assumed trade-off.
So what did they find? Did the worms confirm the old ideas, or?
The results were truly eye-opening, a profound surprise, really. They found that experimentally increasing reproduction under DR by using that food odor did not affect their survival benefits. Not immediate survival, not long-term.
Wow, really? No effect.
None. Both the DR and the DR+O groups lived significantly longer than the fully fed controls. And importantly, there was no significant difference between the DR and DR+O groups' lifespans.
So boosting reproduction didn't shorten their extended lifespan.
Correct. Which is a direct empirical refutation of those adaptive hypotheses that predicted a trade-off.
That's huge. It completely challenges that zero-sum game idea between fertility and longevity.
It really does. It suggests lifespan extension wasn't sacrificed, even when reproduction was partially restored by the smell of food.
Okay, so if it's not just a simple lack of resources forcing this trade-off, what's going on? Why do they reproduce less under DR?
Well, their data suggest a large part of that suppressed fertility under DR is actually an evolved strategy-based response, meaning organisms are biologically programmed to sort of hold back on producing offspring in a poor environment.
Even if they technically have the resources stored up.
Exactly. Even if they could maybe squeeze out a few more offspring, especially when they smell food, the evolved strategy is to pause reproduction, wait for better conditions.
It's an adaptive pause, not just a physical limitation.
Precisely.
And did they find anything else besides just living longer without the expected trade-off?
Oh, yes. Beyond that core finding, the research also showed that DR and DR+O treatments significantly improved stress resistance.
How did they test that?
For example, a heat shock experiment. Fully fed individuals died before the end of a 9-hour heat shock. Pretty quickly. But the DRs and DR+O nematodes survived a remarkable 8 and 12 days after the heat shock, respectively.
Wow, 8 and 12 days later. That's a massive difference in resilience.
It's profound. And while DR individuals were smaller initially, both DR and DR+O worms actually grew more between days 2 and 4 of their lives. DR+O even induced faster growth than DR alone.
So they're not just fragile, starved worms. They're actually more robust in some ways.
More robust, more resilient. It's not just about living longer. It's about living better under those conditions.
What about at the population level? Did this translate into any kind of broader advantage?
Absolutely. Connecting this to the bigger picture, their semi-natural conditions experiment was really interesting. It showed that early life DR didn't actually suppress overall population growth compared to the fully fed controls in the long run.
How does that work if they reproduce less initially?
It points to the environment being key. The improved stress resistance in the DR and DR+O worms likely compensates for that slower early reproduction. So post-DR populations could catch up or even grow faster later on. It suggests DR isn't just some lab curiosity. It's an ecologically relevant strategy.
Okay, so the experiments really threw a wrench into the old trade-off models.
They certainly did.
So given these findings, no clear trade-off, strategy-based fertility suppression, increased resilience, the researchers had to come up with something new, right?
Exactly. They were compelled to develop a new theoretical foundation. And this led to the dietary restriction via mutation accumulation model, DRM for short.
Mutation accumulation. That sounds familiar from general aging theory.
It is. The DRM model is rooted in that fundamental concept, the selection shadow.
Right, the idea that natural selection gets weaker with age, especially after reproduction.
Precisely. Think of selection as a bright spotlight early in life, weeding out bad mutations. But as you age, past your reproductive peak, that spotlight dims. The selection shadow grows. Evolutionary pressure to maintain the body perfectly decreases because, the main job of passing on genes is mostly done.
So mutations causing problems only late in life can slip through and accumulate.
That's the classical idea. Now, the DRM model applies it to the DR context.
Okay, how does that work?
It proposes that DR's direct effect is suppressing reproduction. We saw that experimentally. This suppression indirectly changes how selection acts.
How so?
Because when reproduction is suppressed, surviving longer as an adult becomes relatively more important for overall fitness compared to when reproduction is happening full tilt.
Ah, I see. If you're not reproducing now, living long enough to reproduce later becomes more valuable.
Exactly. So selection for traits that enhance survival and somatic maintenance, even at later ages, intensifies specifically in the DR environment.
So the DR response itself The better maintenance, the longer life evolves because survival matters more then.
Yes, and here's the clever part. It suggests this happens via the accumulation of mutations that reduce somatic maintenance, but only in the non-DR plentiful food environment.
Wait, mutations that reduce maintenance in the good environment? How does that lead to longer life in the bad one?
Because in the plentiful food environment, selection against those late-acting detrimental mutations is weaker. That's the selection shadow they can accumulate. But if those same mutations are somehow less harmful or even neutral under DR conditions, because maintenance is ramped up anyway due to the selection pressure shift, but you get a difference. You end up with organisms that maintain themselves better under DR, partly because they've accumulated mutations that slowly degrade maintenance only when food is abundant and selection is relaxed.
So the shorter lifespan on plentiful food might be the thing that evolves due to relaxed selection, not necessarily a direct cost of reproduction.
That's the implication. It's remarkably elegant. The model shows fertility suppression alone is enough to drive this divergence in lifespan. No need for a strict resource trade-off.
It's a very different perspective, less about an active trade-off, more about how selection pressure changes.
Precisely. It's about how selection acts differently when fertility is high versus when it's suppressed. When fertility is high, selection might tolerate mutations, hurting late life maintenance. When fertility is low, like under DR, selection for survival, even late in life, gets stronger.
And they showed this model holds up even with different assumptions about reproduction costs.
Yes, they explored various scenarios. Even if reproduction does have different mortality costs under DR versus non-DR, the core logic, enhanced selection for longevity when fertility is suppressed, still works under a broad range of conditions. It's a robust model. It doesn't need organisms to constantly switch between environments for the DR response to evolve.
This really offers a compelling new way to think about DR. But you mentioned implications beyond just diet.
Absolutely. That's what makes this potentially so powerful. If you connect this to the bigger picture, the DRM model could apply to any kind of environmental stress that reduces fertility.
Any stress, not just lack of food.
Potentially, yes. This suggests an evolutionary pathway for hormesis.
Hormesis. That's the idea that a little bit of stress can actually be good for you, right? Make you stronger, live longer.
Exactly. The DRM model provides a potential explanation why. If a non-lethal stress, maybe brief, cold, mild toxins, whatever temporarily suppresses fertility, then, according to the model, natural selection could favor traits enhancing survival and somatic repair in response.
Leading to increased robustness and maybe longer life as an indirect result.
That's the idea. It's a beautiful potential explanation for why mild stress might be beneficial.
That connects a lot of dots. You think about other examples like that work in C. elegans on the germline.
Right, the Germline-soma interactions. We're damaging the germline, which obviously impacts fertility.
Triggers systemic stress responses in the body cells, increasing survival.
Precisely. That fits perfectly with this model's logic. Damage impacting fertility leads to enhanced somatic protection.
It's like the organism says, okay, reproduction is paused or compromised, time to batten down the hatches and focus on survival.
It's a fundamentally different view of how extended lifespan evolves. Not necessarily individuals consciously waiting out bad times by reallocating resources, but more about how the fundamental forces of natural selection shift when fertility changes. This leads to evolved increases in maintenance under stress. It's quite humbling, really. The trade-off idea seems so neat for so long.
But nature turns out to be more subtle.
Always more subtle, more elegant.
What an incredible journey, then. This deep dive really shows that those older trade-off models, they aren't the whole story, maybe not even necessary to explain DR longevity in general.
It seems that way.
Instead, we're looking at this idea that mutation accumulation in good environments where selection for late life survival is relaxed could ironically lead to shorter lifespans there.
Indeed. And this DRM model provides a general and quite parsimonious explanation. It covers DR, but also potentially other forms of stress-induced longevity linked to fertility suppression.
It's a big step forward in understanding adaptation, resilience, aging itself.
Definitely a foundational shift.
And it leaves us with a really provocative thought, doesn't it? If merely suppressing fertility through diet or other stresses can fundamentally shift the evolutionary scales towards a longer, healthier life, what does that mean for our broader understanding of adaptation and survival in the face of all kinds of environmental challenges? And maybe even what does it mean for us humans living in a world where fertility patterns and environmental stressors are constantly changing? Lots to think about. Thank you for joining us on this fascinating exploration into dietary restriction and evolutionary biology. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the Science Experience for more in-depth insights into the most current and impactful research in science. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning with the Science Experience.